as being under the heavy pressure of a negative or evil force. The individual is quite convinced of many things in this life, and among these things is the belief that he is in some way at a disadvantage, that the work he is doing is not the work that he is suited for, that the estimation of other people about him is not correct. He is misunderstood, he is undervalued, he is overworked, and he is just plain victim. Now, this goes for nearly everyone in some level of thinking. Even those who try to hold a strong psychic idealistic imagery believe that they are in some way victims of injustice. Man is the eternal victim. He is always in a position of disadvantage. This goes back to the primitive fact that man is unable to estimate the true relation of the world in which he lives, unable to dominate the vast and violent mental forces around him, always regards himself with a profound streak of inferiority. Even a superiority complex is merely a desperate defense against personal insecurity. So the individual cannot but feel within himself that providence, fate, accident, incident, circumstance, that these things are working against him to produce a common disaster, and that this disaster itself is a word which means evil star, disaster, and simply indicates that he was born at the wrong time and under unfavorable conditions. Out of all of this, we also, of course, realize the human being's inevitable determination not to admit responsibility for these things. He cannot assume completely the burden of self-directive. One of the reasons that he takes this attitude is also subconscious. Namely, the individual does not feel that he should be held responsible for situations which he does not understand and about which he does not seem to possess the power of direction or control. Under these circumstances, it is evident that his condition remains impossible or comparatively helpless without intervention or without intercession. And here in the fairy story comes the power of the miracle to break the pattern of human expectancy. There is no way in which these problems can be solved on a level. The only way in which they can be solved is by the introduction of some kind of a miraculous or a causal factor. The individual must be saved from this dilemma. He cannot save himself. He is helpless. Like poor little Cinderella, he has nowhere to turn. No one loves him anymore. And he is under the tyranny of a cruel stepmother and her ambitious daughters. She or the soul cannot break this bondage. Something must happen to redeem it, release it, give it opportunity, and to break this pattern. And in a way to prove what the individual affirms, namely, that his own psychic life as Cinderella is a noble life, a pure life, a beautiful life. There's nothing wrong with it. It is the victim of other people. And in order to be released, something has to happen. And the individual does not know how it is going to happen or what is going to happen. And in this emergency, which, like Mark Twain's famous unfinished story, never seems to come to an end, the only power that man has conceived of is divine intercession. Through prayer, through contrition, through patience, through the practice of the virtues, through being continuously good, though continually afflicted, the individual earns or merits a better destiny. And this destiny must come, or else the entire system of idealism involved in the fairy story is a snare and an illusion. There is also this problem that we cannot completely ignore, namely that man's faith in the happy ending must have some ground. If man believed that things would come out well was never fulfilled, or fulfilled so rarely and so scarcely that it made no pattern in society, your good-ending fairy story could not survive. So we come to another dimension that is frequently overlooked, and that is that the individual who can actually and fairly and honestly affirm that he has lived like the hero or heroine of the fairy story, been good to those that despitefully used him, forgiven his enemies, been patient under adversity, and most of all remained indomitable in hope, certain in faith, and persistent in charity, to that individual some good ending must come. Well, these procedures may be universal, but the good ending is always individual. And the majority of persons who have lived by these codes have found a good ending, and that is why the story lives. Now, this good ending is private, personal. It may never find a place in history. It does not involve great changes in society. But it does mean that this individual has lived a constructive life and died with a good hope. And this preserves or keeps the pattern of the fairy story intact. Exceptions, therefore, when examined, nearly always indicate that the leading character was not as much of a hero or a heroine as the situation required. So the happy ending lives because persons have seen it, have known it, not as vast social motions, but as private conduct leading to the simple and natural admiration of neighbors and associates, strengthening family ties, and gradually bringing this person into a reasonable degree of security. And wherever this security is not present, the factors necessary for the happy ending have not been duly practiced. Now, we may say that such due practice involves other people, and we would love to hope that it does. And in many cases it may. But the happy ending depends primarily upon the power of the good fairy or magic within ourselves. The happy ending is best assured and most directly contrived by the individual continuing to practice the power that is given to him by this fairy spirit within himself that has the power of transforming and transmuting adversity through constructive mental, emotional interpretation. And when we get all these factors together, we find that the person who has kept a happy spirit will have available to them this tremendous, needed, creative imagery. And if it has been lost, it can be regained. And by regaining it, we restore the desired state of affairs. In the anima image, we have, of course, the feminine polarization of man's psychic life. And somewhere in the background of things, we have to realize that the androgyne psychic nature must be reconciled, must be brought together and restored or reunited. One of the points that is made in fairy stories by moderns, who have sometimes even attempted to rewrite them, is that the story ends too soon. The story should not have ended when the princess found her handsome prince. It should have gone on for a few more years to the domestic squabble and the final breakup. Then it would have been factual. We don't like to assume that after this wonderful romantic episode, anything could follow different from our own too frequent experience. Yet in almost every instance, the fairy story ends at this point. Some say that is why it is a fairy story. But again, humanity was not without its recognition of values. Man knew long ago that the course of life does not run smoothly. And had it served any essential purpose in his psychic life, the story would have been continued. But from the level of his purpose, it did not mean anything that it should continue. Because the thing that was being emphasized was not the perpetuation of society. The thing that was being emphasized was the ultimate union of the anima animus, or the polarized soul power of man. And once that is united, there can be no divorce and no unhappy ending. Because all unhappy endings here are due to the disunity of these factors. Once they are brought together, conflict, which is the source of man's difficulty, is removed. If, however, they are allowed to remain polarized, they result in conflict and what we call the conflict of personalities around us and in our relations with others. This conflict is essentially motivated and sustained by the psychic conflict of divided parts within ourselves. As long as these parts are in a condition of conflict, of contrast, and to a certain degree of psychic competition, we will have the same situation in society. And it is the inability of the individual to get together with himself that ultimately makes it impossible for him to get together with anybody else. The psychic life is the problem. And the story need go no further, because there is nothing beyond the final union of the two polarities of the soul. That is, so far as folklore is concerned. For it is always this reunion of divided parts, this bringing into harmonious relation the elements that cause conflict. Now, these elements cannot be harmonized by any energy, by any will, by any purpose that is artificial. They can be divided by pressure, but they cannot be united by pressure. They can be brought into conflict by error, but they cannot be united by error. Therefore, all negative factors divide them. All positive factors unite them. And it is only when, through the natural development of the human consciousness, that these polarizations are reconciled, that the individual can look forward to an internal integration that is adequate and permanent. The whole story, of course, practically all of our folklore, has descended through such media as the Roman fable of Cupid and Psyche, in which the polarities of the soul are indicated, and by which much of our modern psychological thinking is motivated today. So now we have a situation that is universal. We have poor little Cinderella, who is suffering from the tyrannies of an evil stepmother. The stepmother is not essentially evil in any way in which you can literally put your finger on it. She is simply self-centered and concerned with the advantages for her own children. The stepmother then becomes a symbol of many things. Perhaps it is a form of the so-called foster mother, not the true mother, because the true mother is an image. The true mother is a psychic image within the being, and the true mother must be benevolent. Consequently, let us assume now that there is a conflict between the mother image in the human soul and the parent mother on earth. because the psychic integration of the human being will not permit the